I think you all know that the last 3 weeks have been, really a challenge for Marion and me. We've had the health issues that we've talked about, and also I've been pretty much immersed in personal events, and even the events themselves have been forcing me to confront some things in my own life, about powerlessness, about letting go, about acceptance, and so on and so forth, and dependence and humility, all the things that I thought that I wouldn't have to deal with in terms of healthcare and so on and so forth. So it's been a really immersive time for me these last few weeks. And right in the middle of all of that comes the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I was not really familiar with Charlie Kirk. I knew him. Marion had come in, I don't know, pretty much at the beginning of the year, I think, and said, did I know of Charlie Kirk? And I said no. And I don't know if like Siri was listening in the room or something, but all of a sudden I started to see clips that were showing up on my feeds in social media. And so I started watching them. And it was kind of a passive introduction. I wasn't looking, but things were showing up. And I was watching him do various debates across campuses and Oxford and Cambridge, and interviews with people like Bill Maher and Gavin Newsom, from all people, and so on and so forth. And I had a real respect for the young man. His mind was brilliant, obviously. I don't know if he has eidetic memory, but his recall and his ability to express himself was all just world-class and top-notch. And I didn't agree with him a lot of the times in terms of what I was hearing, but I appreciated his approach. His approach always seemed to be civil, and if you disagreed, you came to the head of the line, and so on and so forth. So that's really all I knew about him. And so, again, when Marion came in and told me about the shooting, I was just absolutely shocked. It was just hard to piece it all together in terms of why him, and just the brutality of the act itself. I heard that there was a video or several videos of it. I haven't seen them. I'm not looking for them. I don't want to see them. And unfortunately, they haven't shown up on anything that I've been looking at. But then, of course, his family and his family being present at the event itself, everything was just really, really shocking. And then I was even more shocked, or at least as equally shocked, by the response. I had no idea he had the following that he has, an international following. And so all of the memorials and vigils and things that have been kind of popping up worldwide, or at least through the West, has been amazing to me. And I'm getting more and more information as I go, of course. The political response, I was not so shocked at. The political or the predictable response that I kind of expected from both sides, where now Charlie is basically being used as an icon or a symbol of whatever it is they're trying to project, kind of a symbol of their agenda. And so the sad part of all this is that the real man, Charlie Kirk, is being lost in all of this. It's kind of sad that the human being behind the work and behind the image is kind of hard to find. I mean, I'm sure that he's not as good as his supporters are saying, and he's not as bad as his detractors are saying. That just kind of goes across the board for anything. But he was a human being, a complicated and imperfect human being, like all of us. And so the next phase of the stories that I started to hear were that some people were leaving their churches if their pastor didn't speak about Charlie Kirk the following Sunday or the Sunday after that. And not only were they just leaving the church, they were leaving the church for good, calling their pastor a coward, calling their pastor complicit, in everything that he or she, I suppose, was not saying. And so such passion as all of this, I think, needs to be addressed. But typically, in the way that I address current affairs and issues, it's not that I want to talk about Charlie Kirk per se, and I certainly don't want to come down on one side or the other of the debate about Charlie Kirk, because there certainly is one. What I want to talk about is our response to the event of all of this. What does this do to us and for us. Where is this all leading us, both as a church in the macro, but also as individuals? Because as Charlie Kirk has become a symbol of these deeper issues that he represented, those are the issues that we need to deal with. And we need to deal with our responses and maybe take a look at what our responses are. Why do we feel the way we feel? And what are the reactions and why are they reacting that way in mass? Now, is that valid? You know, it's up to us to come through a situation like this, having evaluated what we believe is our personal way forward, not anybody else's, not the church's. Nobody can tell us. But how do we move through this, retain our humanity, retain our following of Jesus in all of this with integrity, with the integrity with which we start, realizing that we can't be left unscathed by something like this. Now, within Christian circles, I'm starting to see that two groups, two camps are forming. And one group is becoming very militant. You know, it's the idea that we need to fight for Christian rights, that we need to fight to try to reclaim our country. Things have slid so far that we need to really up the ante and we need to fight. We need to carry on Charlie's legacy. And the second group that I'm seeing is growing kind of despondent. I was just having a conversation 2 days ago with someone who was really despondent about everything that he is seeing going on. You know, both the events and where the country's going, but also at the Christian response, the church's response. Feeling despair over the situation, feeling despair over the way the church was acting in many ways. And he was even questioning his own faith and questioning whether he should continue to be a Christian because of the things that he was seeing. It was as if he was saying that when faith seems to be the only thing left for us to stand on, that he was feeling disenfranchised by his church and questioning his faith and his beliefs. Now, I can understand both camps, actually. You know, when you feel that everything that you believe in, everything that you hold dear is slipping away, you want to try to consolidate, don't you? You want to try to organize. You want to try to fight. You want to find a way to be able to consolidate things and influence them, to bring them back, somehow to pull back from the edge. I ran across an article that was written just a few days after the assassination by a woman who says that she's a personal friend of Charlie Kirk. She's also in academia and so on and so forth. And there's one paragraph that I think captured the thrust of what she was trying to say. And she writes that many modern Christians don't allow their faith to inform their political beliefs and behaviors. They have bought the lie that their faith must be compartmentalized, separated, segregated from their public life. That somehow we, the people, are allowed to voice our religious freedoms only within the four walls of the church. And she says this is antithetical to the Great Commission. So if you're familiar with the Great Commission, this is where Jesus says, go and make disciples of all the earth. The Great Commission, right? So she is understanding that Great Commission as a call for Christians to influence political and social life. Kind of like the missionizers did in the colonial period. They didn't just bring Christ to the peoples that they served. They also brought a holy way of life. They changed the culture and erased the culture that was there and brought a new culture in. She seems to be seeing and understanding the Great Commission in that way. Now, I had written years before in The Fifth Way, the first book that I wrote, about these kind of phenomena in terms of the four ways before the fifth way. And I included a couple of paragraphs that I want to read to you right now because this has been going on for some time, that even despite the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution, you all can recite that, right? That Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. So there you've got two clauses. One is the Establishment Clause. Congress will make no law respecting a state religion an actual approved religion of the country, and it will not prohibit the free exercise of any religion. Establishment Clause, Free Exercise Clause. Now, despite all of that, the idea that Christians should influence and should have a political voice has been gaining momentum in this country for decades. You know, was it Pat Robertson who ran for president in 1988, and the religious right of that time has just carried on. But read a couple of bits and things that maybe you didn't know that was going on more behind the scenes. There's a documentary film that follows children attending a Christian summer camp formed around a military model. Listen to the language the producers use on their website to describe this Christian group. Quote, "A growing number of evangelical Christians believe there is a revival underway in America that requires Christian youth to assume leadership roles in advocating the causes of their religious movement. This movie follows a group of young children to a summer camp where kids are taught to become dedicated Christian soldiers in God's army and are schooled in how to take back America for Christ. The film is a first ever look into an intense training ground that recruits born-again Christian children to become an active part of America's political future." And in an article in Newsweek, Cut, Thrust, and Christ cites the ferocity with which some Christian colleges and universities are now pursuing the art of debating, fielding national touring groups that have been giving such legendary schools as Harvard a run for their money. Debaters are being seen as the new missionaries, having realized they can save a lot more souls from a seat at the top, perhaps even on the highest courts in the land. The article states, John Green, a senior fellow at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, is quoted as saying, "Evangelicals have always wanted to persuade people to the faith. The new thing is that evangelicals want to be more involved in the world now. Conservative Christian leaders would like to have a cadre of conservative Christian attorneys who then become judges, politicians, and political appointees." And so there is this concerted effort to prepare people for these seats at the top, to get them into, get their debating skills, their thinking, critical thinking skills, and then get all of the degrees and the training they need to move into these kind of positions. And if the influencing is not enough, then maybe what we can do is what this next group is talking about. One Christian group is attempting to repopulate an entire state with their own members. The Christian Exodus is certainly thinking big, as their website states. Quote, "Christian Exodus is orchestrating the move of thousands of Christians to South Carolina to reacquire our constitutional rights by electing state and local officials who are interposed on behalf of the people and refuse to enforce illegal federal acts. Christians have actively tried to return the United States to its moral foundations for more than 30 years. Attempts at reform have proven futile. Christian Exodus offers the opportunity to try a strategy not yet employed by Bible-believing Christians. Rather than spend resources in continued efforts to redirect the entire nation, we will redeem states one at a time. Millions of Christian conservatives are geographically spread out and diluted at the national level. Therefore, we must concentrate our numbers in a geographical region with a sovereign government we can influence through the electoral process." That's ambitious, huh? So all these attempts to try to influence what we see going around us in terms of its differences with what the church believes. Now that Christian Exodus article was 20 years ago. So obviously it didn't work. South Carolina is still South Carolina, but they're not giving up. Realizing the enormity of trying to reframe existing U.S. population centers, they are now planning to build a self-contained, off-the-grid city built from the ground up in the Ozarks of Oklahoma, as well as other places in developing countries of the Caribbean and South America. So they're still looking to find this place where they can live as they want to live, which is what the original settlers to this nation were all about. One of the reasons the Establishment and the Free Exercise Clauses are the First Amendment of the Constitution is because there was no religious freedom in England when the first pioneers, the first settlers came over. You were either Church of England after Henry VIII, or you were Catholic. It just depended on who the king was at that time. If they were Catholic, you better be Catholic, or you're going to be in a lot of trouble and vice versa. And they just wanted to be able to pursue their own religious freedom, which is why they came across the pond over here. And so to try to establish that is something that is deep inside of us. I can understand why these people want to do these sorts of things. But much of this activity that we're talking about here, this mindset, is what is actually troubling the second camp of Christians. Back in 313 CE AD, the Emperor Constantine established the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan reinforced the idea of religious tolerance in the empire. He had just won a civil war. He was trying to reestablish himself as empire of the entire Roman Empire, emperor of the entire Roman Empire. And one of the things he wanted to do was to reverse the previous 11 or 12 years of intense persecution against Christians under Diocletian. And so he comes in and he establishes the Edict of Milan, which grants Christianity a place to be able, in the empire, to be able to pursue their religious traditions. You know, it wasn't just Christianity, it was religious freedom across the board for everyone. But between 313 with the Edict of Milan and 380 with the Edict of Thessalonica, that's when Christianity became the state religion of Rome. So it took 70 years or so, but in that century, that 4th century, Christianity went from being tolerated to becoming the state religion of Rome. And there were many Christians who absolutely would have been celebrating, don't you think? Absolutely just throwing parties, because now finally, not only were they not going to be persecuted anymore, but they were actually allied with Roman power. They actually had the empire with them. And the thinking would be that now we can remake this land as God intended. But here's the interesting thing. That was the exact moment that the desert fathers and mothers headed for the hills. They looked around and said, what is going on here? We don't recognize our church anymore. This makes no sense to what we were understanding the gospel was all about. And they fled into the deserts of Egypt and Judea and established their own communities because they couldn't find what they were looking for anymore in their own villages and their towns. And this was the beginning of the Christian monastic movement. But isn't it interesting that at the moment that Christianity was seen to be at its apex, in terms of now being recognized as a state religion of the greatest empire maybe the world has ever seen, that is when they decided to get out. And it seems to me that we're poised on a moment like that. You know, there is all this talk of where are we going in terms of Christianity and our faith, and all these forces and all these accusations are being laid out. But there is a moment that seems to be coming. And how are we going to respond to that? How should we respond to that? What's our way forward as we look at all these forces at play? A few weeks ago, we were talking about ethics, and one of the ethical theories is called virtue ethics, and that's where you take an ideal human character, one that has all the attributes that you see as worthy of emulating. That becomes your virtue agent, and you look at that person and say, well, what would they do in situations like this? And you use them as your guide. And of course, for us as Christians, it's a no-brainer. WWJD, right? What would Jesus do? Well, that is another restatement of virtue ethics. In this case, it's WDJD. What did Jesus do? That's what we need to take a look at. Let's look at the Gospels, and let's figure out what was Jesus doing in his time, in the 1st century, with Judea occupied by the Roman army, with factions within Judaism, fighting Rome at every opportunity, fomenting unrest, doing political assassinations, anything that they could do to destabilize the region so that they could have a revolution, throw out the Romans, and reestablish themselves as a sovereign nation. All this is going on as Jesus is trying to just work through his public ministry. How did he deal with that? All these calls for him to take on the mantle of the Messiah, the Mashiach, which would have meant military power, and so on and so forth. But when you look at Jesus in the Gospels, the most fascinating thing is you first realize he didn't create a new church. We as Christians assume that he created this church. And we cite chapter and verse, on this rock I will build my church, he tells Peter. But the word that he uses there is ecclesia. Ecclesia means an assembly. It's just a group of people. It can mean those who were called out into this assembly. It doesn't mean a church in the way that we think of an institutional church. It doesn't mean a new religion, certainly, in the way we think of a religion. It just means a group of people that are called out for a purpose. And so it was a group of people within Judaism within which he was working. He wasn't trying to start a new religion. He was trying to reform the religion he was already in. He was looking at Judaism and seeing how corrupt it had become. He was looking at Judaism and seeing how far it had slid into legalism and literalism from the prophets and what they had in terms of their mystical connection with their God. He was trying to return the people back to direct contact with God in a contemplative and mystical way. The way he teaches prayer, the way he practiced his own prayer, going out in the early morning hours to the lonely places and being alone. And whenever he became stressed after an entire day or a difficult stretch of ministry work, to disappear into the wilderness someplace. And he tells them, when you pray, retreat into your inner space. Retreat into your closet. Don't use a lot of words. Don't call attention to yourself. This is all contemplative practice. We see him trying to establish the people's direct contact. The Pharisees and the Pharisaical system, the legal system, the oral tradition, all of that had become a block wall between the people and their God. They had to go through all of these hoops. It was like going through the HMO to get to your health care. It was that bad. Maybe not that bad, but it was pretty bad. And I know something about that now. And Jesus was trying to take the wall down, right? He was trying to get them into a PPO. He was trying to get them into a supplemental plan. Anything where they could get directly where they needed to go. This is what he was all about. He was trying to help them to establish their own Abba relationship. They needed to be able to say with all their hearts that their Father in heaven, the King of the universe, as the Jews saw him, was their Abba, their intimately familiar Papa. This is what he's trying to awaken the people spiritually, to help them to live out their relationships with God, which he called kingdom at its highest value. But within the religion they already had, and within the civil authority that they already had, which was both Jewish and Roman. He wasn't advocating revolution. He was trying to get the people to turn their hearts back to the Father. In place, where they are right now, where they were. This was his primary mission, and you see it over and over again. If you go back and read the Gospels again with this in mind, you will see it there. We haven't, because it wasn't taught that way to us. So often Jesus is taught as a social warrior because he was so socially conscious and he treated everyone equally. You would assume he's a social warrior, but he's not doing it for that purpose. So it's primary for him to have the people to learn to live from the inside out, not to focus all their efforts on changing existing authority and try to make the change from the outside in. True spiritual transformation never comes from the outside in, never comes from the top down. It always comes from the inside out and the ground up. That's the way it works. He knows this. But if we do follow these principles of Jesus, we follow his way, we follow his way of life and living and love and relating, society is going to begin to reflect those values. But they're going to reflect them across the entire spectrum of beliefs in any group. It's not going to be coercing everybody into one belief. It is going to be changing them from the inside out within the beliefs they already have. unless the beliefs they already have are incompatible with the transformation that's taking place, and they're going to shed that skin like a snake. But this is where Jesus is at. This is what he's trying to do. Remember, Jesus didn't convert, quote unquote, the Roman centurion, did he? Jesus didn't convert the Samaritan woman. Jesus didn't convert the Syrophoenician woman. Jesus didn't convert any of the Gentiles that he met and had a connection with, or healed one of their loved ones. He didn't do that at all. That wasn't part of what his relationship entailed. What he did do was to celebrate the transformation in love that connected them with each other and with him. He celebrated the connection that was common to them all, because it wasn't their belief system that he was focused on. It wasn't their belief that amazed him. He's amazed at the Roman centurion. Don't see that often in the Gospels. But he was amazed at the Roman centurion. But he was amazed at his faith. And faith understood as action that is done in concert with the conviction that someone has come to be convinced of, and the integrity between action, belief, trust, conviction, all of that in spirit. Beneath the belief is what Jesus is trying to instill in anyone who will listen. And when he sees it, even in a Roman centurion, he is absolutely astounded and amazed, because it's so striking. You don't see it very often. He is not amazed by any of his closest followers. Do you notice that? But he was amazed by that Roman centurion. But he didn't try to convert him. He didn't say, okay, now you're going to start eating kosher. No, go get circumcised. Come back to me when you're done. Throughout his ministry, Jesus stayed right on point whenever he was challenged on issues such as these. When he was challenged on taxes, when he was challenged on Roman authority, which really is the same thing. The Roman authority came from their ability to tax the people. So that question on the taxes is critical when he's challenged with that. When he's challenged on the law, when he's challenged on the purity codes within the law, when he's challenged on women and children and slaves and anyone who stands outside the law, he stays right on point. He doesn't veer off into the political. He brings it right back. It's amazing. Of course he had political views. Of course he did. How could he not? Of course he knew that the Roman system was brutal, that the Roman system was oppressive and absolutely unfair. But whatever he thought about it is not recorded in the Gospels. Don't you think it would be there if it were important to his message? Of course it would. Every detail in a document so short that survives for 2 millennia is there for a reason, or it would have been edited out. They put in what we needed to know and not anything more or less. But it's not recorded. Now, he also knew that the Jewish system was corrupt, that it had become absolutely legalistic, that it was that block wall. Now, these beliefs are recorded, but notice that they are recorded as his attempt to free the people to be able to re-experience their God one-on-one, not to dismantle the system itself. He wanted to break the people free within the system they had. It's like roaming free inside the cage, which is the way the Taoists put the exact same idea. It's the way Paul said, I've learned to be content in all my circumstances. It's that same idea. We don't need to change the situation in order to feel the freedom, unless we're focused in the wrong direction. The freedom is here. Nobody can make us free but we ourselves. And we don't need anything outside ourselves in order for that to occur. It would be nice if the circumstances changed sometimes, but it's not essential. It's not the primary part. Jesus was working to create a primary allegiance with God in his people, that their first allegiance was with God, not with the state, not with the temple, not with the rabbis and their codes and their laws, not with the scripture even. Primary allegiance is with God directly, Abba, Father. And from that perch, then go ahead and make your personal decisions on all the rest of it. But fight that interior revolution first. Get clear inside first before you turn your attention to the exterior revolution, or you will just be making more problems for people than you will be solving, because you won't be clear about why you're even doing it. Now, this doesn't mean that reform of our systems, everything, especially when we look at our system, that reform isn't important. Of course it is. It doesn't mean that we don't work for it. But if you look at Jesus again, that reform comes as almost a byproduct of living that reform in our own lives first. Not waiting until we reform a system and then introduce ourselves into that reform. We live the reform first, and everything gets changed after that. Seek first the kingdom, and all else is added. It reminds me of Francis of Assisi. Preach the gospel continuously. Use words where necessary. In other words, you're living it. That's the preaching of the gospel. And that's the Great Commission. That's really what it is. Go out among all the peoples of the world and live this gospel. Love people by living this gospel. Help people by living this gospel. And when they ask you questions, then you're free to answer them with why you do what you do, and why you do it with a smile on your face, and why you're there at all in the first place. But only use the words where necessary. The Great Commission is not a political statement. It's about interior awareness that sets the tone for the whole system to be able to evolve. And so with this said, it seemed to me like this was a good time to go back to the basics and talk about some themes again from the Fifth Way, from the book that kind of started a lot of this. But whenever I talk about the Fifth Way, the first thing that people ask is, well, what's the first 4 ways? Right? That's the logical thing. What are the 4 ways? The reason I even came up with this idea is because in studying the scriptures of the first century, I realized that there were 4 main sects, S-E-C-T-S, in Judaism in the first century. And Josephus calls them the 4 excellencies of Israel. And there were four groups. One was the Sadducees, and the other was the Pharisees, and then you had the Essenes, and then you had the Zealots. And each one of them had a characteristic way that they dealt with the challenges that were facing them, their nation, their religion, and their view on God. The Sadducees were the ones who were in charge of the temple. What they did was that they yielded to the power that was being presented in opposition to them. They cozied up to the Romans. They connected, they had contracts, they had deals, and they were able then, because of that, to continue to have their power as in the temple and to continue on pretty much unscathed as a group. So that's the first way, is to yield to it. The Pharisees had a different idea. They were the ones who wanted to influence or manipulate the power that was in their way, that was challenging them. And so they were the ones who are working from the inside, but always trying to influence, always trying to manipulate, always trying to change things into their advantage. The third way was the Essenes. They just looked at everybody and said, a pox on all your houses, you're all corrupt, we can't trust any of you. And they headed for the hills, and they developed communities like Qumran, where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and others in the deserts. And they hunkered down in the purest community that they could forge on their own, and just waited for everyone to blow themselves up. And then they would come back and reoccupy the land, and it would be for God. So that was their idea. So we've got yield, we've got influence, and we've got exit. And the last one were the Zealots. They were the guerrillas of their time. They were the terrorists of their time. And so the last one is to destroy. If you have a block wall in front of you, what can you do? You can yield to it. You can try to influence it. You can exit it, or you can try to knock it down. And that's what they did. They were the ones who were fomenting all the insurrection and all the unrest and the assassinations and so on and so forth. And if you think about it, those 4 ways are the 4 ways that every one of us can deal with the problems in our life no matter what, right? We can yield, we can influence, we can exit, we can destroy. Whether it's a marriage, or whether it's a group. But Jesus is bringing in a fifth way, a completely different way, a way that comes at an oblique angle. All of these four ways are two-dimensional. They move us along the surface of the earth. Jesus' way comes in at this angle and turns all the others upside down, back to front, inside out. Jesus says, if you want to find your life, lose it. If you want to acquire something, you give it away. You want power in your life, then give power away. You want relevance in your life, then make someone else relevant to you. You want to be spectacular, then give someone else attention. You'll never be more spectacular in another person's life as when you make them spectacular in yours. And you will never understand what love means until you give it away. In fact, the only way you know you have any of these attributes is when you can give them away free and clear. That's it. Otherwise, you don't know what you don't know. And so the fifth way is the undoing of all the ways that we acquire things on the face of the earth. It's about servant leadership. It's about the last being first. All the things that he said. When I was going to be ordained, getting to be 23 years ago, however long it's been now, I was slated to deliver my first sermon on ordination day in the church. And so I was all hyped up about the sermon. You know, I wanted the sermon to be the sermon of sermons. You know, I wanted this sermon to just change the world. You know, it was going to be the one sermon that no one had ever heard before. You know, it was going to have power, it was going to have relevance, it was going to be significant, it was going to be all those things. And I worked for weeks and I practiced. Marian's just, she remembers. And so here I am, all hyped up. And 2 weeks before I was to deliver the sermon and be ordained, Marian and I went to visit our friend Lou at the hospital. And I wrote about this in the fifth way. And I want to just read you this section and just kind of sit back and listen. There are moments when life makes sense. Big moments, defining moments, moments that seem to clarify, even justify other moments of your life. Sometimes you sense you're in a big moment. Try to take note, mark it. But I think most times you don't or can't. I had a moment like that a few years ago, and I didn't realize how big it was holding my wife's hand in the hospital room visiting Lou. I couldn't know at the time for sure, but certainly was aware of the possibility that it would be the last moment I would spend with Lou. Lou was old, and he was sick. He was tired of the dialysis and had finally said no more. Big dark patches of blood lay just under his skin and covered much of his arms and the parts of his legs exposed by gown and sheet. I was shaken by his appearance, but Lou seemed unaware and undeterred. He smiled his trademark smile, the one that seemed to split his face into two halves, and said, "You were the only person in the world at that moment." The one with the gap between his front teeth that I'd seen so many times as he'd greet me in the aisles on a Sunday morning. I loved Lou. I loved him, and I loved the idea of him. As he had gotten sicker, I'd taken to visiting him in the convalescent home, and we'd had time to talk in ways that Sunday mornings couldn't hold. I'd gotten to know more than just the smile, but had learned that the smile went all the way to the bone with Lou. In the moment my wife and I were with him, we talked about many things. Most were inconsequential, though, because the big thing was hard to put into words. And when it was obvious that he was tired and needed to sleep, we got up to go. And he took a hand from each of us and squeezed and looked at us with a squeeze too, with the intensity of something he really wanted to convey. With a smile spreading across his face again, he said, "Love each other. Just love each other." He paused for a beat and then added, "And kid around a little." We smiled and hugged and left, and 3 days later he was dead. Lou died exactly 2 weeks before my ordination as a pastor. Thoughts and time had been filled with preparation for the event, and especially the message I was to give. And by the time we had stepped around the curtains of Lou's bed, I had an outline in mind and thought I knew what I wanted to say that Sunday. But in the days that followed our visit and his death, the bigness of that moment with Lou became clearer and clearer until I realized that Lou had already said it all. Everything I was trying to say in just 12 words. It was a gospel according to Lou, complete, intact, beautiful in its brevity. I couldn't say it any better, and any more said would have only been commentary. 12 words. Chapter 1, verse 1, love each other. Just love each other. Chapter 1, verse 2, and kid around a little bit. Lou loved us and loved to kid around with us. His love was the way he had decided to live his life. But his kidding around was the way that we knew we were loved. His playfulness made his love real, not the love itself, because love is never transferred directly. The effect love has on our choices is all that can ever be felt by another. We often say that love is a decision, and so it is, in part. Love may have been Lou's decision, but his kidding around was the proof that he actually liked the decision he made, that his decision had transformed him from someone who practiced love to someone who had fallen deeply in love. Lou was transformed, and that made all the difference. You see, we celebrate and we chase the big things. We think our faith is advanced and even proved by the spectacular changes, the systemic changes that we can make. We want to build organizations and networks and armies. We want to speak truth to power. And sometimes it is all that. But sometimes it's just an old man, a tired old man dying of diabetes. It's not about what we build. It's who we are that is building that's at issue. It's how we build that's at issue. Because without the transformation first, what have we got? We can even do a heck of a lot of good without being or before being transformed. But that's not Jesus' point. That's not his focus. And understanding Jesus' focus is the first step to actually following him, wouldn't you think? If we don't even know where he's focused, how are we going to follow? We're going to be all over the map. We need to know what Jesus' focus is so that we can follow. And characteristically, Jesus is going to give us that focus in a metaphor, because he always does. This is a primary metaphor, though. This is an arc metaphor, if you will. And I want to read you just one last section from the fifth way to see if we can lock in what it is that Jesus is showing us is the main metaphor for life in kingdom as he sees it. Is there a primary metaphor for our spiritual lives? If so, then we seem to have collectively decided as a church that it's the image of the warrior that suits us best. We speak of being soldiers for Christ. We put on the full armor of God as we prepare ourselves and our children to take and occupy the land. We even organize ourselves in paramilitary fashion. Our imagery is largely imperialistic in nature, an invasive, conquering mentality in which foreign lands and foreign hearts and minds must be bent to the will of God. We say we do this in love for the eternal good of those in our path. But if they don't see it that way, we must fight until they do. And in the fighting, we understand that we will be attacked by the enemy. In fact, we often say that one way of knowing that we're on the right track is to measure the amount of opposition we face as the enemy finally begins to take notice of our accomplishments on the field of battle. This is the image and metaphor toward which we've gravitated. But it is certainly not the only one in Scripture. In fact, Yeshua never uses it. He seems to have preferred a very different image in his teachings, that of the gardener or the farmer. Instead of fluttering banners and snorting horses and deafening drums, there is the quietly bent back of the gardener, breaking up the soil, preparing the ground for seed, squinting into sun and wind for hints of coming weather. Yeshua's stories and images speak of a flowing in concert with tides and wind rather than a strident opposition, a watching of the succession of seasons with feet and hands deeply embedded in dark earth, feeling it turning underneath, bringing sun and rain and all the essentials of life. Instead of a sudden bending, violent bending into submission, there is a slow and steady, infinitely patient tending and nurturing into fullness. So, are we warriors or gardeners? Of necessity, we are at times one or the other, or both. But as we follow the life of Yeshua through the Gospels, we see much more gardener than warrior. There is that patient tending and growing of relationships, a willingness to let everyone and everything take whatever time is needed to come to fruition. Yeshua is always present and vigilant, but never coercive. Plants ripen in the due course of their season, and no amount of force on the gardener's part can change that fact. The gardener's success is in intimately knowing the seasons and the times and the tending in order to be a part of that flow and to be standing in the right place at the right time when the heavy fruit falls. Maybe then we are reluctant warriors who fight when we must, but always with a wistful eye over our shoulders, longing for the silent fields of home. For the moment we can literally beat our swords back into plowshares and take up the work we love. This is just how it feels to begin walking the fifth way after walking the first four ways our entire lives. Like falling into the arms of a loved one after an exhausting and frightening ordeal. The four ways striving against overwhelming power and insurmountable odds, fighting always uphill, upwind, and upstream with our ancient weapons to yield, manipulate, exit, and destroy, are as much a joy and relief to leave behind as a battlefield littered with our dead. To stride out of the smoke, to feel the wind at our backs instead of our faces, to glide downhill and pick up speed, to be content to let the earth turn without pushing, are the hallmarks of the fifth way, as opposed to the first four, of the gardener as opposed to the warrior. For many weary warriors out there, it's time to come home. You see, when we become serious about really seeing Jesus as he must have been from these clues that we find in the Gospels, when we become ready to let go of everything we've been carrying around our entire lives, all the armor that we've always believed that would keep us safe, when we're finally aware enough, or maybe just tired enough, to start connecting the dots between the people we meet and the Christ we seek, especially the least likely that we meet, like an old man simply dying of diabetes. When we can see in their quiet struggles their ability to accept life with gratitude and to smile right in your face as they pick up and carry on when you thought there was no strength left, then our transformation is well underway. And no matter what life will require of us, whether it's a high-profile work on stage, even a worldwide stage, or almost absolute anonymity for all except a close circle, it's all the same. Because the essential part is always accomplished unseen. It's an inward transformation. That's where Jesus is trying to focus us. All that is seen is how we process whatever falls to us to accomplish. Big or small means nothing in the face of the unseen connection that we're forging in the transformation of Jesus' way. And the how of Jesus' transformation looks so much more like a gardener than a warrior, even though it is always both and, never either or. But check your pulse and check your blood pressure, even when you're acting as a warrior. Because this warrior in Jesus' kingdom is not going to be characterized by anger or anxiety. If we're really following Jesus, we're going to be a happy warrior. Still capable of compassion. Still patient. Still aware that outcomes are not under our direct control. We will be an honor to fight, conducting ourselves this way. A humble warrior with a gardener's heart, always looking through the conflict to the silent fields of home. Let's pray. Father, it's so hard to stay on point. You showed us how to do it, and it still escapes us. As we look at our world, we see so many things that are so wrong. From whatever perspective we're looking, we see so many things that are so wrong. And our hearts cry out for change. Our hearts cry out to redress those grievances, those injustices. And we can't understand why things exist and work the way that they do. Help us not to let those passions and those drives take us ahead of ourselves before we have done the interior work, or enough interior work that we can sustain the push and pull of what that exterior work will require and remain decent humans, remain your children that you would recognize, remain in your how as we do whatever we have chosen to do. Help us to stay balanced, Father. Help us to put the primary first. Fight that interior revolution and keep fighting it. And every time we're pulled off track, to come back to it, so that our presence wherever we go will be a welcome one. It will be a healing one. It will be a wise one. We want to be the salve that our world needs, that our family needs, that our friends need in everything that we do, in every moment we occupy. Help us, Father, to keep that in mind as we move forward. And thank you for everything you shower on us. And never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name. Amen. Let's all stand.